Thank you, Chris. So hello. My talk is about Mars. And I've entitled it Mars Kicking Up a Storm, Mars's Transit to Aries in 2020. So I'm going to cover why do this talk at all and why now in a minute. And then I'm going to go on to the nature of Mars. Mars, particularly in Aries, Mars in aspect to Jupiter, Saturn and Pluto, those planets it's going to square over the course of the next 6 months. Mars retrograde, natally and in transit. The key timings for that, and those people whose charts are going to be particularly sensitive to this period of time. Something about anger and self-awareness and the choices that we have. So why talk about Mars in Aries and why now? It's going to be in the sign of Aries for about 6 months. It entered in June the 28th, and it won't go into Taurus until early next year. So that's a long time. And that's because it's going to make a retrograde. And during the course of that retrograde, it'll make 3 waxing squares to the planets that are currently in Capricorn: Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter. So, of course, that's in the context of the ongoing conjunctions of those planets in Capricorn. It's also going to conjunct Aries, which has been in Aries for many years now. And the context of that is that Aries, planet of discord, has been square to Pluto all of this year and on into next year, which is enough to make us feel that we might want to put on a tin hat or hide under the cushions. Which begs the question, what is the point of astrology if it just makes us more anxious? We have plenty to be anxious about as it is. We don't need astrology to tell us what's happening in the world. You just need to look around. And if we do have a look at what's going on, clearly after the January conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, the whole virus, COVID-19, exploded, which has made profound changes to all our lives. We've been in survival mode for some time. And for most of us, there have been profound life changes. For some, of course, some are grieving, some are mourning, they've lost loved ones. And for many of us, there is a fear, a distrust of what other people are doing. For lots, there's been a huge economic fallout. Many people have lost their jobs or are afraid of losing their jobs. So it's quite a difficult time. And over a longer period of time, looking back and to our society at the moment, we have huge inequality. Within the richest nations, there's a huge disparity between those who are the top of the 1% of 1% in the world. They own so much money and so much wealth compared with most people. And then there's this huge disparity between the rich West and the developing world. There's the injustice towards Black and ethnic minority people that has come up again recently with police brutality. We live in an adversarial culture, a blame culture, where you're hung out to dry if you do anything wrong. We can't trust the media or our politics. And we live in a rather decadent and consumerist society. And all that's within the context of a climate crisis that could threaten our survival on Earth. So, as I say, plenty to make us anxious already. And if astrology just feeds into that fear and makes us more anxious, it's not really helping. So what can it do? What's the point? Well, It can give us a greater understanding of what's going on by looking at the archetypes and things that affect human beings and are part of our nature. It certainly can tell us about timing, when things are likely to get tricky and the times to be most aware. It can help us to move towards some sort of self-awareness, and by doing that, give us more choice. So let's look at the nature of Mars. Well, Mars, the spirit of battle, is beautifully illustrated by sport, which is a sort of ritualized battle. Mars is vital energy and passion, and it needs a healthy outlet. It needs to feel free and independent and have adventures and test its limits. And sport is all about testing limits, being active and determined. And whether it's a sport where you pit yourself against opposition or you pit yourself against yourself, you're going for a personal best. There's a striving for excellence. The Greeks had a word, arete, and the pursuit of excellence and personal best is beautifully illustrated by sport. Mars is the planet of desire, of love, of libido, of sex appeal, but it's also whatever we desire. If you think about a toddler who wants something and whose wanting is blocked, having a little fit in the middle of the supermarket because he can't get something that he wants, that's a Mars reaction right there. And Mars is about survival. We've got these nestlings here. They're vulnerable to all sorts of predators, but they still cheep lustily when the parent birds come and bring them food. And they're competing for food. They're competing for survival. They're determined to make it. Mars is what keeps us alive. It's the instinct and will to survive. Perhaps, though, the part of Mars that troubles us is this spirit of war. This is the side of Mars that most distresses people. But there always has been war. There always has been fighting between people. And it does beg the question why. I believe that human beings are not naturally ferocious and deadly. Soldiers have to be made. And they're made in a very particular way. First of all, there's something about the twisting of good beliefs, a love of home, of patriotism, ideas of duty and honor and sacrifice and love are twisted. And they learn as soldiers to perceive the other, the different person, as the enemy, and to perceive the enemy as the monster. And young people, as they're turned into soldiers, are separated from their home and made into a sort of new brotherhood by a process of armoring and desensitization. I mean, the way in which people are made soldiers is a sort of breaking down before it's building up again. There's a lot of bullying, lots of repetition. They become completely exhausted. They're really pushed to their limits, and that desensitizes them. And you have to be desensitized if you're going to go and kill someone. And then on the battlefield, that loyalty to your the people that you've been training with kicks in, as does the survival instinct. If soldiers can be made, they also need to be unmade, because the aftermath of conflict is appalling. We know about PTSD much more now than when we used to call it shell shock during the First World War. But any soldier coming home from war is going to be grief-stricken. They will have seen their companions killed. They'll be scared. And there'll be a range of grief and mourning the shock and denial and anger and refusal to believe what's happened, and then moving on to depression and loss of hope before acceptance can come in. All of those aspects of grief. And a huge need for safety. I think this applies to all of us. When we've been under some sort of stress, there is a huge sense that we need to feel safe. And we need to do something to address the beliefs about other people who are different being monstrous. That other people who think things and believe things or act in a way that's different from us, that somehow they are bad and wicked, and there's a great deal of that going on social media at the moment. I think we need to really look at that. We need to see our shared humanity, and we need to look for fair and just solutions where there are injustices. We need to look at truth and reconciliation. I want to spend a moment looking at the role of Aries in myth, because although we associate Aries with this boiling rage and red mist, things are not quite what they seem. Now, the Roman Mars was an honoured god. He was also the god of agriculture, and he was the patron of builders and craftsmen. We see in Mars the more civilized function of the archetype, with a code of honor. But Aries was a god that was 700 feet tall, prone to all-consuming rage and uncontrollable lust. And he's sort of more the primitive, amoral, fundamental instinct to survive at all costs. And so I want to talk a little bit about the myths to do with Aries. They're not quite what we might expect. He was described as golden and beautiful, and he was certainly huge. When once he was laid low by a blow from Athena, he was said to cover 7 plethora, and that's apparently 30 meters. Anyway, he's about 700 feet tall. So, but I want to talk about his origins. Most say that he is the son of Zeus and Hera, but there's one rather interesting story that he sprang from Hera parthenogenically without Zeus being involved at all. And this was because she touched a herb in order for that to happen. But this happened primarily because she was profoundly jealous of Zeus and his constant philandering. And he also managed to produce Athena from his forehead, apparently without a woman being involved. And so to a certain extent, in that particular context, Aries was the son of Hera's jealousy and rage against Zeus. And even if he was the son of Zeus, Zeus was not fond of him. He rejected him and said some pretty rude things about him. And looking at Aries' motivation, he was accused of changing sides in battle. And he did indeed change sides. But originally he was on the side of the Greeks, sitting on the sidelines in the Trojan Wars. But it said that Athena, who was fighting on the side of the Greeks, and Hera was also on that side, against Aphrodite, who of course had caused all this mess in the first place. Well, Aries had caused that. We'll come to that later. But yeah, Athena sent her hero, Diomedes, to fight, and he fought and wounded Aphrodite, and then went after her son Aeneas, and after Apollo, who moved to defend Aeneas, And at that point, Aries, who loved Aphrodite and had an ongoing relationship with her, he changed sides and he fought then on the side of the Trojans. So he fought for the person that he loved. And there was another occasion when he took vengeance on behalf of his daughter, Alcippe, who had been raped by the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. And Ares killed this son and was tried by the gods for it, but found innocent. And again, he was defending someone he loved. And although he's the god of battle, and we tend to assume that he's does well in battle, that's not always the case. He wasn't always victorious. Hercules managed to defeat him on a couple of occasions, and when some giants laid siege to Olympus, they captured Ares and imprisoned him in a bronze jar, and he was there for 13 months and had to be rescued by Hermes. So he wasn't as invulnerable as we think, and indeed he was wounded by the spear of Diomedes and let out an enormous cry. It said that he fled back to Olympus, bellowing in pain. In his fall, he roared like 9,000 or 10,000 warriors together. So Aries is not quite the god we think he is. He was a fatherless child, a tool for revenge, not always the hero, but wounded and vanquished and motivated in battle by those that he loved. So this raging monster is, to me, I think, very reminiscent of a vulnerable child. If we think of a young child who's hurt themselves, the whole world it's just everything is awful. The child wails as if the world is coming to an end. So, Mars in Aries. This is strong in its home sign. It's the ruler of that sign. It's very strong there. It's a very pure form of Mars, not modified by other influences. It's young and it's vital and it's passionate. It's immediate. There's a sense of urgency. And if its way and its desires are blocked, then there's a seething sort of frustration and sense of impending catastrophe. And I want to look at this energy of Mars in Aries through three people. Obviously, people are more complex than the archetype itself, but Jane Goodall, highly independent, had a very unusual career looking at how chimps, how they interacted with one another. She was an ethnobiologist, and she was accused of anthropomorphism because she gave the chimps that she studied names. That wasn't the done thing in those days. She's very energetic and active. Even in her 80s, she's very active in educational work, in promoting vegetarianism and animal welfare. She's quite outspoken as well, as is Nigel Farage. Now, whatever we might think of Nigel Farage's politics, it's certainly clear that he's goal-driven and highly independent, strong-willed, energetic, active, go-getting. He was active in industry before he went into politics. Tends to be quite impulsive. There were moments when he resigned and then went back and took on the leadership of his party again. Clearly has very strong views and isn't afraid to express them, and indeed one might argue that he courts controversy and is rather feisty and argumentative. And Russell Brand also has that side to him, the feisty, argumentative side, quarrelsome. He's certainly controversial and opinionated, Russell Brand's also quite defensive and easily irritated. There was a time when he was being prevented from getting to the airport with his girlfriend or fiance, and he took by a paparazzi who was taking photographs on his mobile phone, and he grabbed the mobile phone and threw it through a window. He was also responded to an insult from Bob Geldof by saying that he dined off I Don't Like Mondays for 30 years. But he's strong-willed. He got clear from drugs. So they all have in common this energy and independence and go-getting nature and strong desires. I want to look at aspects of Mars to Jupiter, Saturn and Pluto, because Mars is going to make squares, waxing squares, to those three planets while it's going through Aries. So Mars-Jupiter is a very expansive energy. It can represent fortunate or lucky action. It's active and optimistic, and there's an expectation of success that does help to accomplish objectives. With Mars square Jupiter, there's lots of energy for working together or for friendly competition, but also the possibility of irritation, bickering and conflict, and a possibility of blowing things out of proportion, hype, spin and catastrophizing. Certainly an increased urgency and a definite need for using the energy, a definite need for action. If we look at Mars-Saturn, that's about harnessing your hard work and your energy to some sort of useful work, hard work and sustained efforts. And this is an aspect that can support focused and painstaking and exacting work. When it's square, there may be issues of bad timing or delays that cause frustration and anxiety. There may be obstacles that need to be overcome, clashes of ego and blocked action. Someone might be working at cross purposes to someone else. There might be clashes of unconscious rules and expectations, and clashes because people differ in those ways, and there's a possibility of coming up against intransigent points of view and fixed ways of perceiving things that are difficult to shift. So to deal with Mars-Saturn, one needs discipline and patience and sustained effort. And one also needs honest and assertive communication so that you can overcome any differences of opinion. It's important to address the issue of boundaries respectfully and responsibly, and to be timely in how you express your anger, and expressing anger in an appropriate way, not aggression or passive aggression, but honest communication and assertion. Before I go on to aspects of Mars to Pluto, let's just have a look at this chart. So what we have here is someone whose Mars is conjunct the moon, so very caught up with emotions, very expressive, and it's making a square to Pluto. So you've got profound depth of feeling clashing with the ego. And all of this is expanded by Jupiter. So we've got Jupiter opposite Mars and again square Pluto. And all of this is part of a grand cross, because opposite Pluto, we've got the Sun. Sun opposite Pluto, Sun conjunct Mercury opposite Pluto, someone who's likely to express themselves in a very direct and forceful and powerful way, and an emotional way as well. And let's have a look at who this belongs to.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious. That ball was on the line. Chalk flew up. It was clearly in. How can you possibly call that out? Now keep walking over. Everyone knows it's in this whole stadium, and you call it out? You got the absolute pits of the world, you know that?
I'm going to award a point against you, Mr. McEnroe.
So aspects of Mars to Pluto, and in particular the Mars-Pluto square, very strong. So aggression and the survival instinct meet cosmic power. It can cause an intense and fundamental transformation, but there is a strong drive to wield power, and often it's power over. The square is particularly challenging. It can be hostile. There's opposition from others. There's intense competition and some investment of energy in being right at another's expense. There are physical and psychological battles for domination and the possibility of violence and destruction and defeat from outside forces. But at its best, Mars-Pluto is the conscious direction of power to a positive and worthy end. Mars-Pluto at its best is about using energy powerfully, working hard to achieve something that's really difficult, focusing your creative energy to solve a problem. It could be forensic analysis of what's necessary to be done. And that process can transform the people who are involved as well as the issue itself. I've mentioned the fact that Mars is making waxing squares to the planets in Capricorn. So a square is a challenging aspect, and it creates friction and highlights issues that need to be addressed and resolved. A waxing square in particular comes early in a planetary, in a synodic cycle. It's highly energetic, it's highly impulsive, it's really of the moment. There's a very strong push to action and to getting things done. And I think, especially with Mars squaring Saturn and Pluto, there's something here about clearing out the dead wood, clearing the ground, cutting out the dead wood, and doing whatever is necessary to move on and to move forward. It suggests brash, bold, new initiatives. However, the fact that Mars is retrograde means that there are going to be 3 passes, and therefore this going over old ground and changes attempted are likely to meet with resistance and take some time to really take root. But in summary, Mars in square to these Capricorn planets, yes, there will be struggles for power and resources, but perhaps some festering boils will be lanced. Saturn will present us with obstacles and frustrations and delays, so we need to be self-disciplined and patient and to have some sort of practical aim. And with Jupiter, we could get things blown up out of proportion, but Jupiter gives us the possibility of an ethical vision and some hope for the future. So, moving on to the process of retrogradation. This is when a planet appears to go backwards in the sky, and it's due to the position of the planet relative to Earth and the Sun. In this diagram here, taken from Erin Sullivan's book, you've got the Sun in the centre, here is Earth, and the path of the superior planet, in this case Mars, is shown by this outer circle here. Now, at the point when we perceive the outer planet conjuncting the Sun, it's actually at its furthest point from us, and we can't see it because it's in the daytime sky. It's not until the planet reaches the nighttime sky that we begin to see it at all. And then as it passes these points here, it makes a square and then reaches the point of retrograde. And at the point number 5, where it's in opposition to the sun, that's actually the closest point. Then the planet moves on past that point and makes a trine and stations direct and carries on forwards. And I hope that the next slide will give us a clear idea of how that happens. Okay, so it's seen as going backwards against the stars of the night sky. With Mars in particular, it takes about twice as long to orbit the sun as we do. So it takes about 2 years to go around the entire zodiac. At opposition, it's bright. Here we show, this shows how we see Mars when it's projected against the stars of the night sky. And you can see it's still moving forwards at the moment. And then we get to opposition and it's moved backwards. It's already stationed retrograde and starts to move backwards. It's still moving backwards. And at this point here, it's beginning to move forwards again. So it's gone direct. And this particular video was made for the Mars retrograde that took place around 2010. You can see the planet moving forwards and then it stations and it begins to move, apparently to move backwards against the stars of the night sky. Then it stations again and begins to move direct. And although that process happened back in 2010, it's going to look something pretty similar now. So the planet is initially moving forwards, stations retrograde, moves backwards, stations direct, moves forward again, and then reaches the end of its path of the retrograde. So a retrograde planet in the natal chart is a bit like a battery that's had its polarity, that's turned around, had its polarity reversed. The energy, instead of being expressed outwards, is turned inwards. It's still powerful, but it's hidden. It's not expressed particularly easily. And indeed, it may be projected onto other people, a sort of expression of that moment when the planet is opposite the sun. Now, Mars is a yang, outwards, expressive planet. It likes to make its energy felt in the world, and if stressed, its energy can be suppressed and can be denied, but there are going to be consequences. So Mars retrograde is a bit like the warrior in retreat. There may be difficulty in expressing needs and desires. A person may be hesitant to make demands and a bit passive. They could avoid expressing desire or anger, and the anger can be controlled and turned within. And then if it's stressed, this can lead to a bigger than usual vulnerability to either depression or to outbursts of uncontrollable anger. Of course, that is not... That's not just true of people who happen to have Mars retrograde. That can happen to all of us. What this does give, because sometimes Mars energy can fizzle out, especially in Aries, it's a very immediate sign, and unless it's sort of fueled, it can fizzle out. But Mars retrograde can give us certain determination and staying power. It is possible for the function of Mars to be projected onto others, and Erin Sullivan suggests that it's a bit like a battle with the sun. The heroic ethos has been stifled, and there's a difficulty in finding the hero inside oneself, and a tendency to project power onto others, or to see others as being sexier and more effective, and so on. Someone who's got Mars retrograde natally is Bernie Sanders. And in finding out about him, I think he demonstrates enormous patience, determination, and staying power. He came from quite a poor background as a child. He was quite an athlete in baseball and a number of other things. He had intense political feelings. His heritage was Jewish, and he was motivated by his parents' experiences of losing so many loved ones in the Holocaust. They got out before it, but they had a number of relatives who died, obviously, as did all Jews. Bernie Sanders worked lots of different jobs, and he tried again and again for political office. He stood as an independent, which didn't make things exactly easy for himself. And when he did eventually get power, he raised money for his assault on the presidency through lots of individual donations. He really did it the hard way. He battled the system, and he battled the media, who was not given much airtime. And as a member of the Senate, he was more effective at getting lots of amendments to bills than carrying forward any particular cause. But he was very good at working with people. I said that astrology can give us a good idea of timing. So let's look at the timing of the retrograde period in particular. Well, Mars is currently going direct. It's just entered Aries, and it will continue to go direct for some time, but it enters the retrograde zone on the 25th of July. It enters 15 degrees of Aries, which is where it will eventually retrograde backwards to. So then carries on forwards until the 9th of September, when it stations retrograde. And it stations retrograde at 28 degrees, gradually makes its way backwards to 15 degrees, stations direct on the 13th of November, and then moves on, and doesn't exit that retrograde area of Aries until the 2nd of January next year. In the process, it makes, apart from the squares that I've already mentioned, it makes a number of other aspects. It will conjunct Aries. It'll make 3 contacts to Aries. Now, Aries is the goddess of discord, the uninvited guest at the wedding who kicked off the Trojan War by leaving an apple labelled for the fairest that the 3 goddesses, Aphrodite, Hera, and Athene, battled over in the Judgment of Paris. And that, of course, is what led to the Trojan Wars. Aries is a goddess of discord. She was said to stalk the battlefield, rejoicing in the cries of dying men. But on the positive side, this intense competition can lead to excellence. Thinking back to that sports slide, personal bests, the striving for excellence. Both Mars and Aries have this signature, and they were in fact brother and sister. In terms of timings, in mid-July, Aries stations at 24.5 degrees Aries, and then takes the rest of the year to retrograde back to 23.5 degrees, making a very strong square to Pluto all year. And Mars is conjunct Aries towards the end of July, early August, very close to the time when it squares Jupiter for the first time. It's also conjunct Eris in the first week of October, which overlaps when it squares both Pluto and Saturn. And at the end of the year, between around the 19th to the 26th of December, which is close to the 3rd Pluto square. So Eris is involved in all of those. I've mentioned the 3 contacts and the waxing squares to Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto already. So Mars is known as a trigger for ongoing configurations in the sky. It will also sextile the North Node in Gemini and the South Node, and it'll trine the South Node in Sagittarius. And again, it'll make 3 contacts to those. Now, the nodes represent our collective destiny, and the fact that it's making more flowing, easier aspects makes me hope that perhaps the challenges we're being confronted with are going to be possibly ultimately positive. We have the chance to do something good here. Maybe we are being pushed to confront structures in our society that aren't fit for purpose. Maybe we are being pushed to make changes for the better. So the picture of timings for the 3 outer planets and the nodal axis is quite complicated. So I've shown this in a series of slides here. First of all, we've got Mars still going direct in late July and August. Each of these, the lightest colour shows when Mars is within 3 degrees of making a square, and then 1 degree, and then the darkest colour is the day that it perfects. So first of all, we've got Mars coming up to square Jupiter on the 4th of August. And no sooner has that become, that passes, then it begins within 3 degrees of squaring Pluto. And that builds to a climax on around the 12th and 13th of August, begins to fade just as 3 degrees come in to Mars squaring Saturn, which builds up to the 24th of August. And shortly after that, it's very close to trining and sextiling the nodal axis at that time. So perhaps we can use that energy of Saturn and Mars with self-discipline and patience, but really we really need to look out for that period in early August, the 4th, the 12th, 13th, and the 23rd, 24th, 26th of August are going to be important times. The first pass, we might get an idea of what's going to be happening. Mars actually stays within a 3-degree orb of Saturn right the way through September. So it's also the first planet that it squares again for the second time. It squares it pretty much as Saturn turns direct. So at this period of time between September and October, Mars is now retrograde. It's already stationed. Jupiter's direct, having stationed on the 13th. But both Pluto and Saturn make their station direct during this period of time, very close to the time that Mars makes the squares to them. So we're talking about Mars-Saturn perfect on the 29th of September. We come into October and Pluto is kicking in at the same time as the trines and sextiles to the nodal axis. It's almost precise there. So the 9th of October is when the square to Pluto is exact. And then as that begins to fade, we get the square to Jupiter, hopefully a chance for something more positive to come out, but a possibility of heightened spin there. This slide is actually the same as the previous slide, but it puts in the Sun in Libra when the Sun opposes Mars. So you've got that T-square between the Sun and Sun opposite Mars squaring the outer planets in Capricorn. And that happens on the 13th, 14th of October. And the squares are exact to Pluto on the 15th and exact between the Sun and Saturn on the 18th of October. November's a bit quieter in comparison, but it is the third and last of the ongoing Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. We've just had on the 30th of June, we had the second of these. So we got a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that perfects on the 12th of November. And a couple of days later, Mars stations direct. It's at some distance from that, it's 15 degrees, whereas the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is at 22, 23-ish. But fairly soon after that, towards the end of November, Saturn is within 3 degrees of Jupiter again. And this takes us to the end of the year, where Mars makes its final square to Pluto as we're coming up to Christmas. But that actually happens after both Jupiter and Saturn have gone into Aquarius. And of course, they make their conjunction together, which we'll be talking about at Aquarius 7 later in the summer, their conjunction on the winter solstice. So we got the final square to Pluto, which does happen in Capricorn and Aries. But the final squares to Saturn and Jupiter don't happen until after Mars has entered Taurus on the 6th of January. They happen in middle to end of January. So how can the astrology help us become more aware and more self-aware? Well, when Mars is retrograde in the sky, it's not a time when it's easy to push forward with the actions we want to take. There's something of a time for a strategic retreat, a regroup, and a time for thinking about things and reviewing where we are. So when Mars is retrograde, we're likely to be challenged in ways that make us review our needs and our desires and how we use our energy. We need to have a think about where we're going to use our energy. And this illustration of the pole vaulter, it's a bit like a coiled spring. The energy is pulled backwards in order to fly over that bar, to reach something much higher. And that French phrase at the bottom there actually means to take a step back so as to be able to leap forward better. And I think that's what this Mars retrograde is going to be about. It's going to be about how we use and channel our physical and psychic energy and how we assert ourselves and whether we do so in a healthy way. Are we going to be aggressive or passive aggressive? Or are we going to suppress our anger, sweep it under the carpet? Or are we going to be assertive about our needs and desires? We've got a chance to think about what they are, what's really worth going for. The sort of challenges that we are going to face, we need to think about the extent to which we allow stresses and frustrations to build up and erupt in unhelpful ways. We need to think about where we draw our boundaries and how well we defend them. We need to have a think about unfair and unbalanced situations that need redressing. But it will be a time of reviving old grievances and remembering historic injustices. And although there is the chance to right wrongs, there is going to be some angry, frustrated feelings out there. And at the world level, we'll get all the possible expressions of the aspects, the positive and the negative. So there's going to be some uncomfortable times ahead, and it's likely that things will come to a head, especially with Pluto in the mix. We'll need to be courageous, strong, and use our energy. So whose charts is it affecting? Well, if Mars makes a hard aspect, an opposition or a square or a conjunction to your Sun, your Moon, or the other personal planets in your chart, Mercury, Venus, Mars, or it makes an opposition, square, or conjunction to your ascendant and descendant axis, or the midheaven and IC axis, then you're likely to be dealing with quite strong versions of this energy. And that will happen that if you've got any of those sensitive points in Aries and Capricorn, but also Libra and Cancer, and in those last degrees, the 15 to the 28 degrees of those signs. You're also more likely to be affected if Mars is strong in your chart. If you've got Scorpio rising or Aries rising and Mars is your chart ruler, or if Mars is very strongly aspected as in McEnroe's chart that we saw earlier, then this is something which is likely to get triggered. And also, there's a generation of young people around their 30s who were born with Uranus and Saturn and Neptune all in Capricorn, the Capricorn generation. And some of those are likely to have, well, they'll be going through their Saturn return, will have been going through that or will be going through it now, and they will be particularly affected. And this is true of whether we're talking about our own natal charts, the natal charts of public figures, obviously, or also charts for specific countries. We look at the Capricorn generation. I've got an example here of a chart. The larger one is of someone born in 1991, and they have Saturn quite late in the sign. And the earlier one is taken from 1989, and you can see that you've got Saturn conjunct Neptune and Uranus in the mix as well in Capricorn. So it's likely that generation will be affected. Then towards the end of the year, once Jupiter and Saturn have made their way into Aquarius, then December 2020 and January 2021, those with sensitive points in the early degrees of Taurus, Aquarius, Scorpio and Leo are likely to feel the energies more strongly. But it will be affecting all of us. It will be affecting all of us. It's a big chunk and will be affected by the behaviour of people around us as well. So there'll be some difficulty during the retrograde in pressing forwards, and we'll be feeling probably a bit frustrated. I've mentioned that where Mars makes hard aspects to personal planets, that's likely to be affected. The other thing that we need to look at is the house that Mars is passing through, the house that Mars occupies natally, and those houses that have Aries or Scorpio on the cusp in your chart. So what can we do? Well, we need to have our antennae out so that we can recognise when conflict is brewing. And we do need to address those issues beforehand, ideally, assertively. We also need to find an outlet for our energy. And as much as possible to find tools that help us to cope with the strong energies that we've got. It might be meditative practice, prayer, relaxation, breathing exercises, or physical exercises. This photograph shows a gym that's powered by the energy expended when people are actually using the exercise machines. And in other words, there's a dynamo. You used to be able to get dynamo lights on bicycles, so that when you pedaled and the dynamo was connected, it transferred your movement energy into light energy. So a dynamo is a way that something can be transformed. Energy can be transformed from one form to another, and that's when it does work. And this dynamo the word has its roots in dunamis, which is a word that means power with. And when we think about Mars, Pluto, rather than power over, I wonder if we can do something with other people, have power with others, to work together to some noble aim. Mars is about passion and anger. So we might need to ask ourselves some questions. Where am I stuck? What's blocking me? And what actions do I need to take that will help me to move on? Is it something that can be tackled head on, or am I going to have to move around it and work around it? And before this energy comes up, it's worth thinking about what issues might come up that have their roots in the past. Is there something that we could address early? Is there something that we've been ignoring? Passions tend to ignite when they trigger something that's a vulnerable spot from the past. Where are we vulnerable, and how can we address those vulnerabilities? Some people find it quite hard to express their Mars energy. They prefer to sweep conflict under the carpet, or they might express it in passive-aggressive ways, like saying, thank you, when someone doesn't thank them. But we all need to take up some space in the world. Do I feel okay about that? And can I set and defend my boundaries? Can I be clear about what my boundaries are? Can I express my anger openly? And might it be better to hiss early on so that I don't have to bite later? Some of us, of course, find anger comes very easily, and our rage is triggered easily. And we have to be careful about who we direct this anger towards. Are we really aiming it at the right target? And what is it that triggers us? What triggers my rage? What sparks my anger? Being aware of our spark points. We need to make sure, especially with Jupiter, that we're not getting things out of proportion. How clearly am I seeing this? And above all, when rage is triggered, what vulnerable feeling does this disguise? Can we find a more measured and assertive way of using our passion and our anger? Can we find something that's worth fighting for? Can we be the spiritual warrior? Can we ask what's at stake here? What boundary has been crossed? What do I want to achieve? And for whom? What's the most effective response? What's the real target? What are the consequences of taking action? And what are the consequences of not taking action? And can we express what we need to express assertively and cleanly? And greater self-awareness gives us choice. When we confront Mars, we need to learn courage. There are many challenges in this world. What challenges do I need to face? Stephen Forrest is fond of saying that in a Mars time, the thing that you need to know is that you have to face the bears. What bears are challenging us at the moment? Is there something about climate change? What is it that you want to use your energy to address? So Mars is necessary aggression, the need to assert yourself. It's desire and will, survival instinct, purpose in life. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's your sex drive, what gets you going. But when Mars is particularly active, we need to use the energy, or it will use us. Can we use that energy? Mars in Aries is a wonderful, fizzy, enthusiastic, urgent, headfirst, young energy. What is it that we want to birth? What can we do that's worth doing? It's time to align to a higher vision. What is it that we want to spark in our lives? Thank you. Thank you.